Welcome to News 9 Live, and you are watching On Point with me. And before I take you to today's On Points, let's take a quick look at the headlines. Russia-Ukraine war escalates. Russia launches missile barrage in retaliation for alleged attack on oil refinery. BLA claims 102 Pakistani soldiers killed in Operation Haraf in Baluchistan. West Asia tension rise as Israel and Hezbollah exchange heavy fire. Heavy rainfall in parts of Gujarat. Schools closed even as floods displace hundreds. MHA announces a creation of 5 new districts in Ladakh. No respite from floods in Tripura. Over 26 have died and over 1 lakh rendered homeless. Prime Minister Modi pledges full support to the state. Violence breaks out in Bangladesh once again as students clash with paramilitary forces in Dhaka. BJP distances itself from Kangana Ranawat's remarks on farmers' protest. Ahead of Haryana polls, reprimands the Mandi MP. Me Too in Malayalam film industry. More actors accused as prominent figures resign from key posts. Welcome back. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has proposed India as one of the potential hosts for the second Ukraine Peace Summit along with other global South countries. He had conveyed this idea to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, highlighting India's status as the world's largest democracy. Zelenskyy also mentioned that discussions are underway with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey and Switzerland regarding the summit. However, at the same time, the Ukrainian president said it would not be possible to host a summit in a country that has not yet joined the comique of the last peace summit.
India is also participating in our work on the peace formula. It was represented at the peace summit, and we are working in the relevant groups according to the peace formula. All of this gives us optimism, and it is important that as many global actors as possible clearly express their position on the fundamental norms of international law and visit Ukraine, showing their support in a tangible way. Of course, today we also discussed the bilateral agenda with India. 4 intergovernmental documents were signed by our representatives. There are also agreements on other areas of cooperation, including military technical cooperation. The Prime Minister of India, Modi, visited Ukraine. This is the first such visit in the history of relations between India and independent Ukraine. We had a long discussion, covering Russia's war against Ukraine and the need to ensure a just peace. We greatly appreciate that Mr. Modi began his visit by paying tribute to the Ukrainian children whose lives were taken by Russian aggression. We are grateful for the humanitarian support packages that India has been providing throughout this war. It is also important to us that India remains committed to international law and supports our sovereignty and territorial integrity, basic principles.
During Prime Minister Modi's historic visit to Ukraine, the first time an Indian Prime Minister who actually visited a war zone, Modi urged both Ukraine and Russia to engage in immediate dialogue to end the ongoing conflict. He also emphasized India's readiness to play an active role in restoring peace. The visit, which lasted nearly 9 hours, marked the first time an Indian PM visited Ukraine since independence in 1991. His visit came 6 weeks after he held summit talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin that triggered anguish in some Western countries. PM Modi reiterated India's commitment to peace, asserting that India has never been neutral in the conflict but has always stood for peace. He also assured Zelenskyy of India's respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty.
और मैं आज यूक्रेन की धरती पर शांति का संदेश लेकर के आया। एक्सेलेंसी, यहाँ से पहले मैंने ग्लोबल साउथ के कॉन्फ्रेंस की, करीब 120 देश के लोग थे, मैं उनकी तरफ से भी शांति का संदेश लेकर के आया। एक्सेलेंसी, आप भली भांति जानते हैं, यूक्रेन के लोग भी भली भांति जानते हैं कि शांति के हर प्रयास में भारत का सक्रिय योगदान रहा है। और आप भली भांति जानते हैं कि हमारा अप्रोच पीपल सेंट्रिक रहा है। और मैं आपको भी और पूरे विश्व समुदाय को विश्वास दिलाना चाहता हूं, और वो भारत का कमिटमेंट है, और हम स्पष्ट मानते हैं कि संप्रभुता और क्षेत्रीय अखंडता का सम्मान हमारे लिए सर्वोपरि है। हम उसका समर्थन करते हैं। कुछ समय पहले समरकंद में जब राष्ट्रपति पुतिन से मिला तब मीडिया के सामने आंख से आंख मिला करके मैंने उनको कहा था कि ये युद्ध का समय नहीं है। मैं पिछले दिनों रशिया के मुलाकात के लिए गया था। वहां भी मैंने साफ साफ शब्दों में अपनी बात कही है कि किसी भी समस्या का समाधान रणभूमि में कभी भी नहीं होता है। समाधान का रास्ता बातचीत से ही निकलता है, डायलॉग से निकलता है, डिप्लोमेसी से निकलता है। और हमने बिना समय गंवाए उस दिशा में आगे बढ़ना चाहिए।
The first Ukraine Peace Summit took place in Switzerland in June with representatives from over 19 countries. Although India participated, it did not endorse the communique that emerged from the discussions, instead stating that it would remain engaged with all stakeholders to facilitate a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Meanwhile, Zelenskyy expressed concern over India's ongoing oil trade with Russia, suggesting that India's economic engagement with Russia is prolonging the war. He emphasized India's global influence and suggested that India could help end the conflict by halting its oil imports, which are financially supporting the Russian military.
India, big influential country, not only in the world, also through the circle of very skeptical countries. If we will change Indian attitude to this war and to Russia, we will stop the war, because Putin will want to stop it.
His main currency is oil. If he's not going to sell oil or gas or other chemical products, then, frankly speaking, he will have very significant challenges with paying pensions, with paying salaries inside his own country. They're not selling their technologies, and their economy is very slow, so they do have a kind of an energy-based economy, and they're export-oriented. So if the countries won't be importing energy resources from the Russian Federation, then they will be helping the whole world.
However, this criticism raises questions of double standards, as Zelenskyy seems to overlook the significant purchases of Russian gas by Western countries during the same period, while urging India not to prioritize its energy security. So, coming to the moot issue, will Prime Minister Modi hold a peace summit? And will he? And if he does, what should be the contours? Is there a possibility, or is just a position which the world wants to see India in? On this, I am joined by Solomia Bobrovska, Member of Parliament, Committee on National Security, Defence and Intelligence, Deputy Head, Ukrainian Delegation, NATO, live from Ukraine, and Ambassador Anil Trugunayat, former Indian diplomat. Thank you very much, sir. But let me cut across to Solomia Bobrovska. Thank you so much. I know electricity is an issue there. I heard your message, and so thank you for joining me at a time when we even don't know whether you will be able to have a conversation like this. Is there a soft answer to a hard question like war? Do diplomacy work in ending wars?
It's a really very tough question, because when we see our map and battlefield now in Ukraine, we see how Russian troops are aggressive, and then how map is moving, unfortunately, fast, again occupying new towns and villages. So I don't know whether, I'm not sure that now diplomacy can take a place now between Russia and Ukraine, because the suffering of Ukrainian nation now and the tragedy and the loss we are now facing, they are too huge. And we understand their plans for autumn and winter with the all energy infrastructure. So I'm not sure that from the both sides that we are ready to have any kind of negotiations. We have asymmetric response for Russians. That's a Kursk region. That's a part of our defensive operations. But still, at the same time, even if one day we would say that diplomacy has to take the priority role, now I cannot say that we are ready for that, and we see that, especially in the light of really very high possibility to occupy Donbass from the Russian side.
Both this, at least from the Ukrainian sides, there is a call for peace every time. You don't need to have a time for peace. You can be ready for peace for any time. But the war is shaping up in a different direction. From drone attacks to occupying territory, I mean to say at one end the peace is being spoken about. On the other end, the war has become bigger, far more intense.
Absolutely, you're right. But peace is not just a word. We are losing and we lost couple of our regions, actually, and the only one and prior one thing is to withdraw Russian troops and to give Ukraine just to breathe. That started 10 years ago, and it's just impossible to say let's have a peace here. No, maybe one day you can hear this from politicians, but not from the ordinary people, which suffered from Russian bombs and from the raped women, by Russian soldiers. That's impossible. And we want the peace on very adequate and according to the international law rules. And we want our borders, international recognized borders, back. That's when we can face the peace.
Let me also introduce Ambassador Anil Trignayat. Sir, thank you so much for joining me. Do you think, I read your article also, in context of the consumption of oil, and I completely agree that there cannot be one rule for the West and another for India in context of the war. But do you really think that there is a possibility of India organizing a peace summit?
Well, I think that I agree that there is essentially a lot of problem in this war. It's escalating currently. And therefore, talking of peace at this stage may sound preposterous, as our dear colleague from Ukraine mentioned. But at the same time, there is no alternative to peace. The wars can continue, but they will be bringing more mishap, more destruction, more problems for the ordinary citizens. And that is the reason that a country like India is propagating the dialogue, diplomacy, peace, respect for UN Charter from the very beginning of this war. We have always told Prime Minister Modi, as you know, has spoken to President Putin twice on this and made two very important statements. That one was that in Samarkand that this was not an era of war, and second, this time during his visit, that solution cannot be found on the battlefield. Same situation is prevailing there. But what he has been doing is he's been requested by very many countries from the West, including President Zelenskyy, that India should play a more constructive role. And in my view, after the G7 meet where he met President Zelenskyy in the first place, then he went to Moscow where he met Putin, and now he is was back in Ukraine. And that's what he has been estimating. The levels of red lines, the levels of comfort, levels of possibility, trust, and the intent to somehow have a ceasefire and then move forward exactly how things are going to work. But as far as I understand, India probably did not present a peace formula. Now that, which is indicated from the joint statement that was issued, in which President Zelenskyy would have obviously said that the communique that was issued in Switzerland should be the basic framework for negotiations. That is completely at variance with what the Russians are aiming at. Of course, they want to keep what they have acquired, about 25% of the territory, making it into a buffer zone, as well as Ukraine not joining NATO. For the Ukrainians, this is a red line. So therefore, unless these two vertical positions are bent somewhat, the dialogue will not be very productive. There was a possibility within 2 months of the war, which were really squandered because of the British and the American stance that they wanted to strategically defeat Russia, using Ukraine as a pedestal. Frankly, that's what they did. And today we are in a situation where we are. We don't know whether Ukraine will be able to regain it by force or by war, by the territory that this is lost. The only way out will that be through the negotiations, through a dialogue, through some kind of a treaty, which should be supervised by the international organizations or like the United Nations or other in those 4 provinces. There could be several modalities. But of course, India is against acquisition of territory by force from any country, and we have always respected the territorial integrity and sovereignty for all the countries. In our very first statement, if you remember, when we said respect for UN Charter, it was clearly implicit that it implied that the Ukrainian territory was being taken by the Russians. Of course, there are historic reasons, there are NATO expansion and all kinds of things, but nothing justifies a war.
A para of the article you have written, quote unquote, no doubt as External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said, it is a very complex issue. Both sides seems to have vertical position, as you mentioned now. It has been a big question to what extent are they willing to bend to come to the table. It appears despite the war fatigue and exceptional losses in all respect, Kyiv, in bracket, backed by its Western allies, and Moscow are hell-bent on carrying on with their quest to defeat the other. So, when you are saying that willing to bend to come to the table, in your opinion, what can bring to both the warring parties to the table?
Well, I think that there are several reasons. One is that there is a bit of a fear even in Ukraine that in case the US elections produce Trump on the scene, then obviously that would be a major issue for the Europeans who are supporting, as well as for the Ukrainians, because without the US and NATO support, Ukraine cannot withstand the Russian pressure. So that is very much there. That is one fear. Secondly, I think that with the hundreds of thousands of troops have been killed, millions of people have been displaced. There is so much a problem. Both sides are in a war fatigue situation. So that is the only incentive today for them. Unfortunately, the negative one. But I think that this is the only incentive for them to come to terms. Only thing is that from Russia's point of view, I think that joining of Ukraine in the NATO would be a very big red line, and which is why this whole war has gone on. And I doubt very much that if that is not addressed, it will be very difficult for the Russians to get on board.
Soumya, one is the strategic interest of the country, but the other is the domestic opinion, the people's opinion, and they shape up the policy. So in context of any compromise, what is the opinion of people of Ukraine? I think that will matter the most for Zelenskyy in deciding when to have a meeting with the...
Your question is absolutely right, but we still see the polls, and the majority of Ukrainians are not ready to start any kind of negotiations with the Russians. So that's what I mentioned before. The one thing that's the wish of our allies, partners, friends to start the negotiations. The others, that's the nation's will. And we don't see now, it's less than 50%, people are ready. But of course, we see how people are tired, how they're exhausted. We see the mood in the eastern and southern Ukraine. We see, and we will see even more, when they will put down the all energy infrastructure and we will face really severe winter. That is a huge threat for us now. And we passed the last months without electricity. And probably you remember when your Prime Minister Modi was in Moscow, Russians, they hit the children's cardio and cancer, the only one and the biggest one hospital. So after especially these attacks, Ukrainians do not understand why they need to have any negotiations, and why, by the way, the Western, our allies and countries, they, especially US and Biden, because my colleague mentioned about the elections in US, why they still keep the sanctions to use the long-range missiles on striking the Russian territory. I'm talking about the ATACMS and British Storm Shadow rockets. So that would help us to prevent their shelling on Ukraine and to prevent their moving of the Russian troops to Ukrainian territory. That's a very obvious thing. And I want to just mention that US and Britain, UK, and Russian Federation, they took the security assurance and guarantees in 1994, citing the Budapest Memorandum, when we were disarmed from the nuclear storage and weapons, which we had the third largest after the Soviet Union collapsed.
How difficult for you as a parliamentarian, someone who has to do both policy making and represent the interest of the people and also reflect their mood, to balance what is strategically important for Ukraine with what people think is right? People can have any expectations in context of what should happen. But what it is in context of the state's power is a different story altogether.
Absolutely right. It's difficult. For me, it's the most difficult because I'm working with the military families, with the families who have a missing military soldiers, who still have children, prisoners of war, or whose children were kidnapped, for example, in the eastern part of Ukraine. And that's impossible to talk with them about negotiations. We are welcome and thankful to India for readiness to be the mediator, yes, and to host the second peaceful summit. But President Zelenskyy was absolutely right. It is possible when our partners and mediators will accept the basic Ukrainian peace formula, because the only one thing which is the most important in this peace formula, that's a withdrawing the Russian troops. I think that's very obvious, but it's very, very hard now to talk to Ukrainians about the starting negotiations, because no one believes that Russia will keep a word and will not start a war in a year or 2 years. They will just use this time, to strengthen their military capacities, and again, then to start the third wave of war and attack in a couple of years.
Ambassador Tignayet, if we look at the history of modern warfare, either you have a surrender, or you have a settlement of interest, or you have a swapping of territory, or if you look at the armistice in Korea, you have exhaustion of all the possibilities, or the state moves out, saying that we cannot incur the cost of war, which is also a colonial experience. I know you are not a soothsayer, but definitely I will take this liberty to ask you this question. How do you see this war ending in the long run?
Well, I think there are all losers in this war, like in any other war. But one thing sometimes I wonder and see, that none of the superpowers have been able to win any major war in the 20th and 21st century. Look at the United States, for example. In Afghanistan, what happened after 20 years, they got defeated by this. The era of short wars is no longer there. Those 10, 15 days wars, now we are seeing Russia getting embroiled in this for 2.5 years. Then we see the Middle Eastern war, where already 10 months are over, and the most powerful army in the Middle East is not able to take on the non-state actor. On the other hand, you see Soviet Union. It went into Afghanistan, eventually got disintegrated. You see China, which lost in Vietnam. USA lost in Vietnam. So I don't really find that the superpowers, except for death and destruction, they have been able to achieve much. We have seen what USA has done unilaterally in Iraq, and I was ambassador to Libya when I saw this NATO bombing there. So they manufacture the causes to bomb it for unilateral. This is in the nature of the superpower, to dictate its this thing. How do you condone, as far as this war is concerned, and if I were to go by what Prime Minister Modi's discussions with President Putin and President Zelenskyy and other world leaders is that everybody wants a war, but wants a peace or to settle this war. And the conflict, of course, the terms of reference are not at all consonant with one or the other. But I have always believed that actually the real any war can only be in this, whether it's Middle Eastern war or this particular war, can only be ended with the United States being actively on the side of peace.
Are you saying that it cannot be complicit?
It's not complicity. It's a question of, you see, that before this war started, what did Putin ask Biden in Geneva? He asked, I want your security guarantees that there will be no further expansion of NATO into my territory. USA refused it because of the geopolitical reasons. They are still driven by this Cold War mindset despite being a hyperpower. And then you cannot justify Russia's invasion. But what Russia eventually had thought, or probably overestimated their strength, they thought they'll be more than warmly welcomed by the Ukrainians when they go in there. Of course, there are certain Russian, four of these republics.
They thought it's going to be the Hungary.
Yes, it doesn't happen that way. Because see, in my view, if you know the Soviet history, not the Russian history alone, you will know that the Ukrainians are also very brave people who faced the brunt of the German this thing during the Second World War. So they were all Soviets together who have suffered this, and they have the tremendous capacity of taking adversity. So I think looking at the people from that point of view, I think that's a historic mistake. But at the same time, from a superpower's perspective, if you were to look at it, that they thought that they were left with no option. That if Ukraine goes into the NATO, that means you have the NATO forces on their borders. So that's something that has been there. So they would need a certain, I would say, guarantees, although I don't believe that any country can guarantee the other. That is a bit naive in today's world, as we have seen these being violated again and again by all the countries.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. But you know, going by the president, I would definitely say, unless and until you have something to exchange, or exhaustion of possibilities, or the big brother gives up. No war in the recent modern times, and you very rightly said, has been won by the superpower. So going by it, the only thing which is of consequence is that you don't have winners in wars like that. So the economies bleed and people lose out. So before I end this program, I leave you with another bite of Zelenskyy, in which he is talking about peace, and specifically in the Indian context.
India will play this role. I think that India began to recognize that this is not just conflict, this real war of one man, and his name is Putin, against whole country, which name is Ukraine. And you're a big country, you have big influence, and you can stop Putin, and you can stop and hold his economy and put him really on his place. And his place, you know.
Joe Biden is not going to be the Democratic presidential nominee.
I made my choice. Kamala Harris is experienced. She's tough.